Imagine, if you will, the heat of an August afternoon in 1590. The air on the outer banks of what we now call North Carolina is thick, heavy with salt spray and the oppressive humidity of late summer. A man named John White stands on the deck of a small vessel, his eyes fixed on the shoreline of Roanoke Island. For 3 years, this moment has been a singular focus of his existence. For 3 years, he has been a man haunted by the faces of his daughter, Eleanor, his son-in-law, Aeneas Dare, and his granddaughter, Virginia, the first English child born in the Americas. As the landing party rows toward the shore, there is a desperate, frantic hope. They sound a trumpet, they sing English tunes across the water, hoping to hear a familiar shout in return. But as the keel of the boat scrapes the sand, the only response is the rhythmic thrum of cicadas and the crashing of the Atlantic surf. When they reach the site of the settlement, they find not a thriving village, nor even a scene of massacre. They find a ghost. The houses have been taken down, not burned or destroyed, but dismantled with care. The area is enclosed by a high palisade of tree trunks resembling a fort. And there, carved into one of the massive wooden posts at the entrance, are 3 letters that have fueled 4 centuries of speculation: C-R-O. Further on, carved into a tree near the entrance to the palisade, is the full word, CROATOAN. There were no crosses, the prearranged signal for distress. There were no bodies. There was only the wind and the encroaching forest. This is the moment the lost colony was born in the English consciousness, and it is where our journey begins today. We are here to talk about 1587, the year the dream of an English America almost flickered out into total darkness. To understand 1587, we must first correct a common historical misconception. Many people speak of Roanoke as a single, isolated event, a group of people who showed up, got lost, and vanished. In reality, the 1587 expedition was the 3rd major act in a complex, multi-year drama. To appreciate the stakes of 1587, we have to look back briefly at what came before. The 1584 reconnaissance. This was the scouting mission, funded by Sir Walter Raleigh. 2 captains, Philip Amadas and Arthur Barlow, arrived at the Outer Banks and returned to England with glowing, almost Eden-like reports of the land and its people. Manteo and Wanchese, who would become central figures in the tragedy to follow. And the 1587 military colony. This was the tough guy phase. Led by Ralph Lane, this was a strictly male military outpost. It was a disaster. Marred by a lack of food and escalating violence with the local Secotan people, culminating in the murder of Chief Wignia, the soldiers eventually abandoned the island, hitching a ride back to England with Sir Francis Drake. When the 1587 group arrived, they weren't stepping onto a blank slate. They were stepping into a crime scene. They were inheriting a legacy of broken trust and blood-soaked soil. This was not a military expedition. It was a civilian planting. For the first time, the English were bringing families. They were bringing the intent to stay. So why were they there at all? Well, to answer that, we have to look across the Atlantic to the court of Queen Elizabeth I. In the late 16th century, England was a secondary power looking up at the towering shadow of the Spanish Empire. Spain had the gold of the Aztecs and the Incas. Spain had the massive treasure fleets. Spain had the blessing of the Pope to claim the entirety of the New World. Sir Walter Raleigh, poet, soldier, explorer, and favorite of the Queen, saw Roanoke as a great countermove. The privateering base. Roanoke was perfectly situated to act as a nest for English privateers, state-sponsored pirates, to dart out and snatch Spanish silver ships as they rode the Gulf Stream north. The search for resources. The English were running out of timber for their navy. They believed the New World held endless forests, wine grapes, and perhaps the elusive passage to the Pacific Ocean. National identity. This was about Protestant England proving it could match Catholic Spain. If they couldn't plant a flag, they couldn't claim the future. Raleigh invested his own fortune into the 1587 voyage. He recruited 115 men, women, and children, promising them 500 acres of land each. These were not soldiers of fortune. They were middle-class Londoners looking for a fresh start. They were the year zero of the American middle class. Thanks for listening. Wherever you are in the world, if you're taking a walk, just relaxing for a little while, or falling asleep, I hope you enjoy this story. If you do enjoy this story, like and subscribe for more stories like this. Now let's get back to America's first mystery, the disappearing colony of Roanoke. As we spend this time together, I want to challenge the idea that Roanoke is merely a mystery to be solved like a game of Clue. If we focus only on the disappearance, we miss the profound human story of what happened before the vanishing. The 1587 colony represents a pivotal collision. It was a collision of Elizabethan ambition, the hubris of thinking a map in London translated to reality in the wilderness. It was a collision of logistical catastrophe, bad timing, worse luck, and the ego of sailors. And most importantly, it was a collision of indigenous diplomacy. The fate of the 1587 colonists was never entirely in their own hands. It was in the hands of the people who had lived on that land for thousands of years. We are going to examine the maps, the letters, and the latest archaeological findings from Site X and beyond. We will look at the birth of Virginia Dare and what that child symbolized to a group of people who knew, within weeks of arriving, that they were likely doomed. Finally, we must understand the geography. The lost colony is synonymous with Roanoke Island, but as we will discover, Roanoke was never the intended destination. The 1587 colonists were headed for Chesapeake Bay, a deep-water harbor that would have provided a far better protection and resources. The fact that they ended up on Roanoke, a shallow-water island with poor soil and angry neighbors, was the result of a singular, fateful decision made by a pilot named Simon Fernandez. Because of one man's impatience, 115 souls were dropped into a tiny island that had already been turned into a graveyard by the previous expedition. So let us go back to 1587. The ships are being loaded at Portsmouth. The air is filled with the smell of tar and hope. The 115 colonists are waving goodbye to the white cliffs of England, headed toward a destiny they could never have imagined. They weren't looking to become legends, they were just looking for home. Part 2. The Architect's Vision. Why Roanoke? To understand the 1587 expedition, one must first understand the man who never actually set foot on the island, Sir Walter Raleigh. In the 1580s, Raleigh was the personification of the Elizabethan ideal. A soldier, a poet, a courtier, and a cutthroat businessman. But more than anything, he was a visionary. He saw the North American continent not as a frozen wasteland or a barrier to the Orient, but as a vast, untapped canvas for English power. Raleigh's motivations were triple layered. First, there was the geopolitical layer. England was a Protestant island standing nearly alone against the colossal might of Catholic Spain. King Philip II of Spain didn't just want to defeat England, he wanted to erase it. By establishing a colony in the New World, Raleigh intended to create a strategic dagger aimed at the heart of Spain's treasure fleet. If England could control a port on the Atlantic seaboard, they could intercept the silver-laden galleons that fueled the Spanish war machine. Second, there was the economic layer. England was suffering from social congestion and a lack of resources. The great forests of England were being leveled to build ships and fuel ironworks. Raleigh promised the Queen that the New World was a land of infinite timber, exotic dyes, tobacco, and most importantly, the potential for gold. He wasn't just selling a colony, he was selling a corporate venture. Third, and perhaps most overlooked, was the personal layer. Raleigh was a younger son of a minor gentry family. He had risen to the Queen's favor through sheer charisma and intellect. To maintain that favor, he needed a great work. The 1587 colony was his attempt to build a legacy that would outlive the fickle whims of the court. He was granted a royal patent that essentially made him the lord of any land he could successfully settle. In his mind, Virginia, named for the Virgin Queen Elizabeth, was already his private kingdom. The Chesapeake Plan. Now there is a massive historical what-if regarding the 1587 voyage. It is a common mistake to think that the colonists wanted to go to Roanoke. By 1587, Raleigh and his advisors knew Roanoke was a terrible choice. The 1585 military expedition under Ralph Lane had proven that the outer banks were treacherous. The inlets were too shallow for deep-sea vessels, the soil was sandy and poor for long-term agriculture, and the local Secotan people were now rightfully hostile after the murder of their chief. The plan for 1587 was fundamentally different. They were headed for Chesapeake Bay. Raleigh's instructions were explicit. The colonists were to stop at Roanoke briefly to pick up a small holding party of 15 men left there the previous year, and then immediately sail to the Chesapeake. The Chesapeake offered a deep water harbor, better climate, and, crucially, a fresh start away from the blood guilt associated with the Roanoke site. Had they reached the Chesapeake in 1587, the colony likely would have survived, and the lost colony mystery would have never existed. The tragedy of Roanoke is that it was a destination reached by accident and maintained by coercion. Unlike the previous voyages, which were composed of hardened soldiers and gentlemen adventurers who refused to work with their hands, the 1587 group was a true community. Let's look at the people who made up the 115. John White, the artist governor. John White is one of the most fascinating figures in colonial history. He wasn't a soldier or a professional administrator. He was an artist. He had been to Roanoke on the 1585 voyage, where he produced stunning, meticulous watercolors of the Algonquin people, the flora, and the fauna. These paintings remain our best visual record of pre-Columbian North America. Raleigh chose White to lead because he was a moderate. He wasn't there to conquer, he was there to document and build. However, White's sensitive nature and lack of military authority would prove to be a liability in the face of the rugged, ego-driven soldiers he had to command. Simon Fernandez, the Machiavellian pilot. If John White is the tragic hero, Simon Fernandez is the undisputed villain of the Roanoke saga. Fernandez was a Portuguese converted Catholic, or so he claimed, who had a reputation as a brilliant but untrustworthy navigator. He was a former pirate who had been saved from the gallows by Raleigh's influence. Throughout the 1587 voyage, Fernandez and White were at constant loggerheads. Fernandez was focused on privateering, finding Spanish ships to plunder, while White was focused on the safety of the families. This tension would eventually lead to the fatal decision to abandon the colonists at Roanoke. The families. For the first time, we see names like Eleanor Dare and Marjorie Harvey. There were 17 women and 9 children on the ships. These were people who had sold their homes in London, invested their life savings, and brought their family Bibles and heirloom furniture. They weren't looking for a fight, they were looking for a farm. Among them were bricklayers, carpenters, and tailors. This was a civilian planting, a term that Elizabethans used to describe a permanent, rooted society. Their presence changed the stakes from a military skirmish to a struggle for biological survival. The crossing was a voyage of omen and tension. The 3 ships, the Lion, a flyboat, and a pinnace, set sail from Plymouth in May 1587. From the beginning, the voyage was plagued by the friction between the planters, White's group, and the mariners, Fernandez's crew. White's journals record a series of accidents that he attributed to Fernandez's sabotage. At one point, the flyboat, the slowest ship carrying most of the heavy supplies, was separated from the fleet. White suspected Fernandez of intentionally losing the ship to save time or resources for his own pirating interests. There was also the stop at the island of St. Croix in the West Indies. White wanted to gather salt, fruit, and livestock, essential supplies for a new colony. Fernandez, however, refused to allow the colonists to stay on shore for long, fearing the Spanish patrols or perhaps simply wanting to move on to more profitable waters. This meant the 115 arrived at the North Carolina coast, already low on the very supplies they needed to survive the winter. They were malnourished and exhausted before the real work had even begun. On July 22, 1587, the fleet arrived at Hatorask, the inlet leading to Roanoke Island. This was supposed to be a temporary stop. White intended to take a small party to the island, find the 15 men left behind the year before, and return to the ships to continue the voyage to the Chesapeake. But as the pinnace prepared to head to the island, a representative of Simon Fernandez, and then Fernandez himself, delivered a shocking ultimatum. He told the colonists it was too late in the year to seek out a new settlement. He claimed the summer was fading and he needed to return to the West Indies for privateering before the hurricane season. He essentially told the 115 people, "You get off here or stay on the ships and return to England." White was powerless. He had no military command over the sailors. The colonists, fearing they would lose their 500-acre land grants if they returned to England as failures, made the agonizing choice to disembark. They stepped off the boats onto Roanoke Island, the very place their predecessors had burned and bloodied, knowing they were in the wrong place, at the wrong time, with the wrong neighbors. The first thing the 1587 colonists did upon landing was search for the 15 soldiers left by the previous expedition. They found the settlement area overgrown with weeds and vines. The houses were still standing, but the lower floors were filled with the bones of a single man. According to local reports they later gathered from the Croatoan tribe, the soldiers had been attacked by a coalition of Secotan and Quasquequuck people for Chief Winya's death. The survivors had fled into the Sound on a small boat and were never seen again. This was the welcome the 1587 families received. They were standing in the ruins of a failed war, surrounded by tribes who now viewed every Englishman as murderous invaders. The vision of Sir Walter Raleigh, the dream of a peaceful, prosperous Protestant empire, had just collided with the cold, hard reality of a vengeful frontier. This sets the stage for a tragedy of errors. Civilian Governor John White now has to figure out how to turn a group of London tailors and housewives into a frontier defense force. And in the middle of this burgeoning chaos, his daughter Eleanor is in the final stages of pregnancy. The arrival of Virginia Dare is just weeks away, a birth that would happen in a place that had already become a graveyard. Part 3. 1587. The Arrival and Initial Struggles. When the 115 colonists stepped off the pinnace and onto the sandy soil of Roanoke in late July 1587, they were not greeted by the rolling green meadows described in the 1584 pamphlets. Instead, they found a landscape that had already begun to reclaim the failures of the English. The fort built by Ralph Lane's soldiers 2 years prior was a hollow shell. The melon vines and weeds had grown up through the floorboards of the abandoned cottages. As women like Marjorie Harvey and Eleanor Dare, walked through these ruins, the reality of their situation must have been suffocating. They were not in a new world, they were in a tomb. The discovery of a single skeleton of the 1585 soldier was more than a grisly find. It was a diplomatic message from the local Secotan people. You are not welcome here. John White's first priority was restoration. He ordered the colonists to begin repairing the houses and building new ones. But even as they hammered and sawed, the psychological weight of their isolation was immense. They were surrounded by a forest that was no longer a resource, but a screen for a hidden army. Every rustle in the undergrowth was a potential threat. The planting had begun in a stage of siege. The tension snapped only days after their arrival. George Howe, one of the colony's assistants or leaders, went out alone to catch crabs on a small forked stick. He wandered only 2 miles from the settlement, perhaps seeking a moment of peace away from the crowded camp. He was found later that day, stripped and riddled with 16 arrows, his head beaten in with wooden clubs. This was a turning point. For the families, the murder of George Howe was the end of any illusion that they could peacefully coexist without significant diplomatic repair. The attackers were likely from the village of Dismantled, men who still burned with the memory of the English soldiers' previous betrayals. This act of violence forced John White's hand. He was a man of peace, an artist who had spent hours sketching the dignity of the Algonquin people, but now he was a governor who had to answer to a terrified and angry population. In this dark hour, the colony had one tether to the land, Mateo. Mateo, a Croatoan noble who had traveled to England twice, was the English's greatest asset. He was a man caught between two worlds, dressed in English clothes but speaking the language of the Carolina South. On July 31st, White took Mateo and a small group of 20 men to the island of CROATOAN. Their mission was to renew the old love between the English and the Croatoans. The meeting was tense. The Croatoans initially stood ready to fight, but when they recognized Mateo, they lowered their bows. It was here that the English learned the full story of the 15 who had been killed in the murder of George Howe. The Croatoans asked the English for a token, a sign that they would not be attacked by mistake. They were terrified of being caught in the crossfire between the English and the vengeful Secotans. On August 13th, in a ceremony that feels surreal given the impending danger, Mateo was baptized and named Lord of Roanoke and Dismantled by order of Sir Walter Raleigh. It was the first time a Native American had been given a peerage title by the English crown. It was a desperate attempt to create a loyal indigenous leader who could stabilize the region. But a title on paper meant little in the woods of North Carolina. Mateo was now a man without a country, too English for the tribes and too savage for the English to truly trust. Midway through this escalating crisis, on August 18, 1587, the first English child was born in the New World. She was the daughter of Eleanor White Dare and Ananias Dare. They named her Virginia, a living tribute to the land they hoped to claim. To the 115 colonists, her birth was a momentary flash of light. It represented the why of their mission. They weren't just survivors, they were parents. If a child could be born and thrive here, then the English dream was still alive. But imagine the atmosphere of that birth. There were no sterile rooms, no doctors, only the humid air, the sound of the Atlantic, and the constant gnawing fear of an arrow in the dark. Virginia Dare's arrival created a new kind of urgency. It was no longer just about the men's pride or the queen's gold. It was about the survival of an infant. Shortly after Virginia's birth, another child was born to the Harvey family. These two babies became the emotional hostages of the colony. Their existence made the lack of supplies and the hostility of the neighbors an existential emergency. Desperate to avenge George Howe and strike fear into the Dismantled, John White led a pre-dawn raid on their village on August 9th. They moved through the woods in silence, saw a fire, and opened fire on the figures sitting around it. It was a catastrophe. The people they attacked were not the hostile Secotans. They were a group of Croatoans, their only allies, who had moved into the abandoned village to gather corn. The English had shot and wounded the very people who were trying to help them. Though Mateo managed to smooth over the immediate fallout, the damage was permanent. The English had proven themselves to be incompetent and indiscriminate in their violence. The trust was gone. The Indian policy of the 1587 colony had failed before the first month was out. By late August, the realization hit the colonists. They were not going to survive the winter. The supplies brought from England were spoiled or insufficient. The corn they had hoped to trade for or confiscate was not enough to feed 115 people, including infants. The colonists gathered and demanded that one of the assistants return to England to beg Raleigh for immediate relief, but no one wanted to go. Every man feared that if he left, he would be labeled a deserter. They also feared leaving their families behind in such a precarious position. Finally, the group turned to John White. They argued that only he, the governor, had the weight and the personal relationship with Raleigh to ensure that ships were sent back immediately. White resisted. He was terrified that if he left, his reputation would be ruined. People would say he abandoned his own daughter and granddaughter. The debate lasted days. Finally, on August 25th, the colonists provided White with a testimonial, a written document signed by the leaders stating that they had forced him to go for the good of the colony. With a heavy heart, White agreed. He told them that if they had to move from Roanoke, perhaps to the Chesapeake or further inland, to leave a sign. They agreed on the carving of a name or a location on a cross if they were in distress. On August 27, 1587, John White boarded the flyboat. As the sails caught the wind and the island of Roanoke began to shrink on the horizon, he could see the smoke from the settlement's fires. He believed he would be back in 6 or 7 months. He believed the might of the English Navy and the wealth of Sir Walter Raleigh would have him back on those shores by the spring of 1588. He had no way of knowing that a massive Spanish fleet, the Armada, was already being assembled. He had no way of knowing that Queen Elizabeth would soon order every English ship to stay in port for the defense of the realm. As the coastline faded into a thin blue line, John White was looking at his family for the last time. The 115 were left under the leadership of Aeneas Dare and the other assistants. They were left with Mateo, a few sacks of grain, a fragile fort, and 2 newborn babies. The silence that followed his departure would last for 3 years, a silence that has never truly been broken. To close out this section, we must ask, what was the plan the moment White's ship disappeared? They knew the Croatans were their only hope. They knew the Site X locations further inland offered better soil and more protection from Spanish ships. Here, in the meat of the history, we see the mechanics of a slow-motion disaster. The 1587 colony didn't disappear because of a supernatural event. They began to vanish the moment they realized they were on the wrong island with the wrong resources. The struggle of 1587 was a struggle of identity. Were they Englishmen clinging to a fort, or were they the first Americans forced to shed their Englishness and integrate into a local tribe just to keep their children alive? As we move into the next section, we will look at those 3 long years of silence and the war that turned a supply run into a decades-long mystery. Part 4. The 3-year silence. When John White finally caught sight of the English coastline in November 1587, he didn't find a nation ready to celebrate his return or rush to the aid of his families. Instead, he found a kingdom gripped by an existential fever. The voyage back had been a nightmare of storms and near starvation. White had arrived battered and exhausted, only to find that the geopolitical landscape had shifted beneath his feet. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, earlier that year, had finally pushed King Philip II of Spain past the point of no return. The enterprise of England, the Great Spanish Armada, was no longer a rumor. It was a looming, terrifying reality. White rushed to Sir Walter Raleigh, presenting the desperate needs of the 115 souls on Roanoke. Raleigh, ever the ambitious visionary, immediately began organizing a relief fleet. He secured the Brave and the Roe, 2 small but capable vessels, and loaded them with the specific supplies White had requested: seeds, tools, livestock, and salted meats. But as the ships prepared to weigh anchor in early 1588, the Privy Council issued a sweeping order. No ship capable of defending the English coast was permitted to leave port. This is the moment that the fate of Virginia Dare was sealed by the high politics of Europe. To the English government, 115 people on a distant island were a footnote compared to the threat of 30,000 Spanish soldiers landing on the shores of Kent. The Spanish Armada was the largest fleet the world had ever seen. 130 ships designed to crush English Protestantism once and for all. Every sailor, every cask of gunpowder, and every scrap of timber in England was requisitioned for the defense of the realm. Raleigh's ships were caught in this net. Even the small vessels White hoped to use were deemed necessary for coastal defense or communication. For the entirety of 1588, John White could only watch the horizon. He watched the great naval battles in the English Channel. He watched the fire ships at Calais. He watched the remnants of the Spanish fleet being dashed against the rocks of Ireland by the Protestant wind. England had survived. The nation was jubilant. But for White, the victory was hollow. The sailing season of 1588 had passed. On Roanoke Island, the colonists' first winter had come and gone, and the relief was still thousands of miles away. There is a tragic, often overlooked detail in this timeline. In 1588, Raleigh actually managed to get special permission for two small ships, the Brave and the Roe, to sail for Roanoke, provided they took no essential war materials. White was on board, his hope finally rekindled. However, the captains of these ships were not humanitarian rescuers. They were privateers at heart. Instead of sailing directly for Virginia, they spent their time chasing Spanish prizes in the Atlantic. Near the Madeira Islands, they engaged in a brutal war with the French pirates. The English ships were boarded, looted, and their crews, including John White, were badly wounded. The ships were so damaged they were forced to limp back to England. White was devastated. He had been within reach of the Atlantic crossing, only to be dragged back by the greed of his own countrymen. This failed attempt meant that 1588 was a total loss. By the time White could even think about another voyage, the winter of 1589 was approaching. Why was there no attempt in 1589? This is one of the most frustrating gaps in the Roanoke record. Following the defeat of the Armada, England was exhausted. Its treasury was empty and its focus shifted to a counter-armada against Spain. Sir Walter Raleigh, the great patron, was beginning to lose his influence at court. He was distracted by his massive estates in Ireland and his escalating rival with the Earl of Essex. More importantly, Raleigh was a businessman. The Roanoke venture had already cost him a fortune with zero return on investment. While White still cared for the colony's fate, the logistical hurdles of finding a captain willing to forego the riches of the Spain Main to deliver a load of flour to a group of peasants were nearly insurmountable. During this year, John White was living in a state of perpetual purgatory. Every day he didn't sail was a day his granddaughter Virginia grew older, or grew hungrier. We have no letters from the colony during this time, but we can imagine the psychological toll on Roanoke. They would have watched the horizon in 1588, then 1599, seeing only the empty blue of the Atlantic. The hope that the governor would return must have curdled into a bitter sense of abandonment. Finally, in 1590, a breakthrough. White was able to secure passage on a fleet of privateers owned by John Watts, a wealthy London merchant. But there were strict, almost cruel conditions. White was not in charge. He was essentially a passenger on a mission whose primary goal was to plunder Spanish ships in the West Indies. He wasn't even allowed to bring the large-scale supplies he had originally gathered. He could only bring what would fit in his personal luggage. The voyage was agonizingly slow. The fleet spent months in the Caribbean, hunting Spanish galleons, taking prizes, and engaging in skirmishes. White had to sit on the deck, watching the months of May, June, and July slip away, the very months he should have been at Roanoke. It wasn't until August 1590, 3 years to the month since he had last seen his daughter, that the ships finally turned north towards the Virginia coast. On August 15, 1590, the ships anchored at Hatorask. As the sun set, the crew saw something that made White's heart leap. A column of smoke rising from Roanoke Island. It was a sign of life. The next morning, White and a landing party rowed toward the shore, but the smoke turned out to be a deceptive trick of the woods, a natural fire or perhaps a tactical lure. They found no one. They sounded a trumpet, they sang English songs, they called out the names of the leaders. The only answer was the rustling of the sea oats. When they finally reached the settlement site on August 17th, they found the scene I described at the beginning of the video. The Croatoan carving, the dismantled houses, the buried chests. White found his own trunks had been dug up by the local tribes or the colonists themselves. His books were torn from their covers, his maps were rotted by rain, and his watercolors, his life's work, were ruined. But he didn't care about the art. He was looking for the cross. There was no cross. According to their agreement, this meant the colonists had moved willingly and without distress. White was convinced his family was on Croatoan Island with Mateo's people. He begged the captains to sail there. It was only a short distance south. The captain agreed, but the weather, which had been brewing for days, turned violent. A great storm, likely a hurricane or a severe nor'easter, battered the coast. The ships lost their anchors. One of the boats capsized, drowning several sailors. The crews, who were already weary from months of privateering and had no personal stake in the lost colony, reached their breaking point. They refused to stay in the treacherous waters of the Outer Banks. Against White's desperate pleas, the ships blew out to sea. They didn't sail south to Croatoan. They didn't even stay on the coast. They were forced by the winds and the damaged rigging to sail towards the Azores, and eventually back to England. John White had been within miles of the answer. He had seen the name of their destination carved into a post, but the wind, the sea, and the cold indifference of the merchant sailors pulled him away. He would never return to America. He would die years later in Ireland, a broken-hearted man, writing in a final letter that he could only commit the colonists to the help and protection of the Almighty. When we look at this period, 1587 to 1590, we have to ask, what did the 115 do during those 1,000 days of silence? The hunger factor. Dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, tells us that 1587 to 1589 were the years of the worst drought in 800 years in that region. The Eden described in the early scouts had become a dust bowl. The defensive shift. They didn't just leave, they dismantled the houses. This suggests a planned, orderly relocation. You don't carefully take down a house if you are being massacred. The choice of Croatoan. Why there? Because Mateo was their only friend. The move to Croatoan was likely a move toward integration. The 3-year silence wasn't a vacuum. It was a period of forced evolution. The English families were learning that England was not coming to save them. To survive, they had to stop being English. They had to become something new. As we conclude this portion of the story, the tragedy of Roanoke is revealed as a tragedy of timing. If the Armada had been delayed a year, White would have returned in 1588. If the privateers of 1588 hadn't been greedy, the colony would have been reinforced. If the storm of 1590 hadn't blown White's ships off course, the mystery would have been solved 400 years ago. The lost colony was not lost to the woods. It was lost to the sea, to the war with Spain, and to the cruel reality that in the 16th century, the Atlantic Ocean was a wall that could take 3 years to scale. Part 5. The Investigation. What really happened? The most compelling and arguably the most logical theory is that the 115 colonists did exactly what they said they were going to do. They moved to Croatoan Island. When John White saw the word Croatoan carved into the post, he didn't panic. In his journals, he expressed a sense of relief. He knew Mateo was from Croatoan. He knew the people there were friendly. In his mind, his family had simply moved to a more sustainable neighborhood. Evidence of integration. The lack of a cross. As established, the absence of the distress signal is the strongest piece of negative evidence we have. The colonists were literate, organized, and followed the governor's instructions. If they were under attack, they would have carved the cross. The Blue-Eyed Indians. For centuries after 1590, explorers and settlers in North Carolina reported encountering Native American groups, particularly the Lumbee and the Hatorask, who possessed strikingly European features, gray or blue eyes, lighter hair, and a proficiency in English-style agriculture. In the early 1700s, explorer John Lawson visited the Hatorask Indians, and noticed that they claimed to have white ancestors and could read. The logic of the drought. As we mentioned in the previous section, the mega drought of 1587 would have made Roanoke Island a desert. Croatoan Island, being further out on the barrier islands, offered different fishing and foraging opportunities. Moving to join a friendly tribe wasn't just a social choice, it was a biological imperative. However, if they moved to Croatoan, why didn't White find them? The storm of 1590 was the primary barrier, but some historians argue that by 1590, the colonists might have already begun to move again, dispersing further inland to avoid Spanish detection. For many years, the official version of the Roanoke story was much darker. This theory suggests that a significant portion of the colony actually followed the original plan and moved north to the Chesapeake Bay, settling near the Lynnhaven River. The Confession of Powhatan. In 1607, when the Jamestown colonists arrived, they began hearing rumors of men who dressed like them, living to the south. Captain John Smith eventually met with the great Chief Powhatan, the father of Pocahontas. According to Smith's later accounts, Powhatan bragged that he had personally ordered the massacre of the Roanoke survivors. The logic was simple. Powhatan was considering his empire. He had been told by his priests that a nation would rise from the Chesapeake to overthrow him. When he found a group of white settlers living amongst the Chesapeake tribe, tribes who refused to join his confederacy, he slaughtered them all to eliminate the threat. Flaws to this theory. While this story was accepted for centuries, modern historians are skeptical. John Smith was known for exaggerating his exploits. Furthermore, if Powhatan had killed 100+ English people, where were the artifacts? Where were the English swords, the Bibles, the copper kettles? While some artifacts were found in the region, they don't point distinctively to a 1587 massacre. Many believe Powhatan may have been taking credit for a smaller skirmish to intimidate the new Jamestown settlers. The Spanish connection, silent executioners. We must remember that England and Spain were at total war. The Spanish were not oblivious to Raleigh's plans. They had spent years searching for Jacan, their name for the English settlement in the Chesapeake and Roanoke area. The case for a Spanish strike. We know from Spanish archives that Governor Pedro Menendez de Marquis sent scout ships up the coast in 1588 and 1590. In June 1588, a Spanish ship actually entered the Chesapeake and found evidence of English activity. The theory posits that a Spanish naval force found the Roanoke colony during the 3-year silence and wiped them out, or took them prisoner to the West Indies. The Spanish were notorious for removing heretic settlements. They had famously massacred a French colony in Florida at Fort Caroline in 1565. The counter-evidence. The Spanish were meticulous record keepers. If they had captured or killed 115 English men, women, and children, it would be in the archives in Seville. There would be a report to King Philip II bragging about the destruction of Raleigh's nest of pirates. No such record exists. In fact, Spanish records show they were still searching for the colony as late as 1600, suggesting they were just as frustrated by the disappearance as John White was. Theory 4. The mainland relocation and Site X. This is where modern archaeology has turned the mystery on its head. In recent years, researchers from the First Colony Foundation began re-examining John White's 1585 map, La Virginia Pars. Using lightboxes, they discovered 2 small patches of paper where White had corrected the map. Underneath one of those patches, located about 50 miles inland at the head of the Albemarle Sound, was a tiny 4-pointed star symbol, the symbol for a fort. The importance of Site X. This led to the discovery of Site X and the nearby Site Y. Excavations at these locations have unearthed 3 things. Border wear. a type of English pottery used by the 1587 colonists but not by the later Jamestown settlers. Agomidolite slate for writing tablets, and metal fragments, pieces of English tools and clothing. This theory suggests the colony split. The majority, the families, moved inland to Site X to build a permanently protected settlement away from the coast, while a small holding party stayed behind on Roanoke to wait for John White. When the holding party eventually gave up or was forced to leave, they carved the CROATOAN sign to tell the inland group where they were going, or to tell White that the plan had changed. We must also consider the internal story. 115 people trapped on an island during a record-breaking drought would not remain a cohesive unit for long. As the months turned into years, the social contract likely began to fray. Without the governor, White, leadership would have fallen to Aeneas Dare and the other assistants. If food ran out, if the mega drought killed their crops, and if the Secotans were constantly picking off anyone who left the fort, the colony may have devolved into small, fractured groups. Some may have tried to build a boat to sail for the Caribbean, a suicide mission. Others may have wandered into the interior and been absorbed into various tribes as slaves or low-level members. This isn't a massacre or a move, but a dissolution. In this scenario, the colony didn't go to one place. It went everywhere, disappearing into the landscape through 1,000 small tragedies. The Dark Stones, Hoax or History. In the 1930s, a series of inscribed stones were found across the southeast, purportedly written by Eleanor Dare. They told a harrowing story of the colonists' flight from Roanoke, the deaths of Aeneas and Virginia Dare, and Eleanor's eventually lonely life in the interior. For a brief moment, the world thought the mystery was solved. However, most of the stones were quickly proven to be a sophisticated hoax created during the Great Depression. Only the first stone, found near the Chesapeake River, is still debated by some scholars. If genuine, it suggests the colony was decimated by war and misery shortly after White left. But the Dare stones mostly serve as a reminder of how desperately the American public wants an answer to this mystery, even a fake one. The role of disease. We often overlook the invisible enemy. The English brought with them pathogens to which the local population had no immunity: smallpox, influenza, and the common cold. But the English were also susceptible to the fevers and fluxes of the American swamp. If a significant epidemic hit the fort in 1588, the 115 could have been reduced to 50 in a matter of weeks. A weakened, dying colony would be unable to defend itself or move heavy supplies. The lost colony may have simply been buried in unmarked graves, the wooden markers rotting away long before John White returned. Synthesis: the multidirectional theory. As we conclude this investigation, the most likely reality is a combination of these theories. The lost colony didn't have one fate. Imagine the group in 1588. They are hungry, scared, and the drought is relentless. Group A, the Loyalists, stays at Roanoke until the very last moment, then moves to Croatoan to live with Mateo. Group B, the Pioneers, takes the bulk of the supplies and moves inland to Site X to build the secret fort on White's map. Group C, the Desperate, tries to head north to the Chesapeake, where they are eventually caught in the tribal wars of Powhatan. This explains why there are clues pointing in 3 different directions. The colony didn't vanish, it shattered. To conclude this section, I want to address why we call them lost. From the English perspective, they were lost because they were no longer English. If they integrated, married into the tribes, and began speaking Algonquin, they were, for all intents and purposes, dead to the British Crown. We are looking for a colony, a miniature England in the woods. When that England failed, the people survived by becoming something else. They were only lost to the people who refused to look for them in the faces of the people who were already there. Part 6. Modern Science and the Cold Case. For centuries, historians speculated that the colonists were victims of their own poor planning or laziness. However, in the late 1990s, science provided a powerful alibi for the 115. Dr. David Stale and a team from the University of Arkansas conducted a study of ancient bald cypress trees in the Black River area of North Carolina, some of which date back over 800 years. By examining the thickness of annual growth rings, researchers can reconstruct a precise rainfall history of the region. The findings were staggering. The year the colonists arrived, 1587, marked the beginning of the most extreme 3-year drought in 800 years. This was not just a dry spell, it was a mega drought. The trees revealed that the period between 1587 and 1589 was a time of total climactic catastrophe. This discovery recontextualizes the entire lost colony narrative. It explains why the Secotan and other local tribes were so hostile. They were starving. Every bushel of corn the English tried to trade for was a bushel the tribe needed for their own survival. The Eden described in 1584 had vanished. Science tells us that even if the colonists had been expert farmers, they were attempting to grow crops in a dust bowl. The La Virginia Pars map and the hidden fort. As mentioned in the previous section, the patch discovery is perhaps the most significant breakthrough in the Roanoke studies in the last century. In 2012, researchers at the British Museum noticed 2 small patches on John White's watercolor map of the region. While it was common for cartographers to use patches to correct mistakes, modern imaging technology revealed something hidden beneath the paper. Under one patch, researchers found a small red and blue 4-pointed star. In the language of 16th century cartography, this was the universal symbol for a fort. Crucially, this symbol was located at the head of the Albemarle Sound, roughly 50 miles west of Roanoke Island. Why would White hide the location of a fort? Historians believe it was a matter of operational security. If the map fell into Spanish hands, Raleigh did not want them to know the location of the colony's Plan B. This discovery shifted the focus of archaeology from the sands of the Outer Bank to the clay of the mainland. Excavating Site X and Site Y. Following the map discovery, the First Colony Foundation began excavating a location known as Site X in Bertie County. The findings here have been subtle but revolutionary. Archaeology in the American Southeast is difficult. The acidic soil often dissolves organic matter, leaving only stone, ceramic, and metal. The team found fragments of borderware, a specific type of lead-glazed ceramic produced in the border region between Surrey and Hampshire in England. Crucially, this pottery was common in the late 16th century but had largely fallen out of fashion by the time Jamestown was settled in 1607. They also discovered snappiness, a type of flintlock firearm mechanism consistent with the 1580s, and a small copper aglet, the tip of a shoelace. These aren't just English artifacts, they are artifacts that fit the specific 1587 to 1590 window. While Site X does not contain the remains of 115 people, it provides strong evidence that a small group of English people, likely a splinter cell of the Roanoke Colony, lived there and integrated with the local people. The most controversial and emotionally charged area of modern research is the search for DNA evidence. If the colonists integrated with the CROATOAN, or other tribes, their genetic markers should persist in the modern descendants of those people. The Lost Colony of Roanoke DNA Project has spent years collecting samples from individuals with surnames associated with the 1587 roster. Names like Dare, Howe, Harvey, and Archard, who also have roots in the North Carolina coastal tribes. However, this is not a smoking gun science for several reasons. The lack of a control group. We don't have the original DNA of the 115 colonists. We can only compare modern descendants to people in England with those same surnames. Later integration. English settlers moved into these areas in the 1700s and 1800s, often marrying into the Native American families. Distinguishing between a 1587 gene and a 1750 gene is nearly impossible with current technology. Genetic bottlenecks. Small populations often lose specific markers over generations. Despite these hurdles, the presence of certain European DNA in families with long oral traditions of Roanoke ancestry keeps the theory alive. It moves the story from what happened to them to who are their children. In recent years, the hunt has moved from the shovel to the sky. Researchers are now using light detection and ranging to see through the dense forest canopy of North Carolina. This can detect subtle depressions or elevations in the ground that are invisible to the naked eye, traces of a palisade wall, a cellar, or a defensive trench. This technology is currently being used to scan the areas around the Chowan River and the Alligator River. The goal is to find a geometric signature, a square or pentagonal shape that doesn't occur in nature. This would indicate the secret fort White hinted at on his map. This allows archaeologists to dig digitally across thousands of acres without disturbing the land, narrowing down where the 115 might have established their second home. The pathology of the Dare Stone. While largely dismissed as a hoax, modern forensic analysis has been applied to the first Dare Stone. The analysis of the stone's mineral composition and weathering tests have been used to determine if the inscriptions were made with modern tools or 16th century implements. While the results are still debated, the stone has become a scientific artifact in its own right, representing how we use forensic linguistics to analyze the voice of the past. Some linguistics argue that the spellings and phrasing on the first stone are consistent with Elizabethan English, while skeptics point out inconsistencies that suggest a 20th century forgery. When we combine all these scientific disciplines, a new picture emerges. Dendrochronology proves they were starving. Cartography proves they had a secret escape plan. Archaeology proves a small group made it to the mainland. DNA suggests they may have lived on in the bloodlines of the region. The science tells us that the lost colony didn't vanish into thin air. They were forced by a mega drought to abandon their coastal fort and dissolve into the interior. They ceased to be a colony, a political entity of England, and became a refugee population, a biological entity of America. The cold case isn't being solved by finding a single mass grave, but by tracing a smear of English presence across the North Carolina landscape. We are finding the breadcrumbs of their survival, a piece of pottery here, a copper aglet there, showing that the 115 did not simply wait to die. They fought for a future, even if that future meant losing their English identity. As we stand back and look at the wreckage of the 1587 expedition, it is easy to view it through the lens of tragedy, a story of abandoned families and broken promises. However, in the long arc of history, Roanoke was a successful failure. The hard-won lessons of 1587 became the survival manual for Jamestown 20 years later. Because of Roanoke, the English learned that they could not rely on a single leader, like Raleigh, to fund a colony from his own pocket. They'd moved towards the joint stock company model, the Virginia Company, which pooled the resources of hundreds of investors. They learned that a colony could not be a military outpost and a civilian farm at the same time. It needed a clear, singular purpose. Most importantly, they learned that the Chesapeake was the only viable location for a deep water port, a lesson they strictly followed in 1607. If Roanoke had never happened, Jamestown might have made the same mistakes and been wiped out just as thoroughly. Roanoke was a sacrificial colony that allowed the English to eventually take root in North America. We must also confront our own obsession with the word lost. To call the 115 colonists lost is a deeply Eurocentric perspective. From the viewpoint of the 1590 English government, they were lost because they were no longer contributing to the Queen's treasury. But from the perspective of the American landscape, they were arguably the first people to truly integrate. If the theory of integration is correct, the 115 didn't disappear. They were the first Englishmen to stop being colonizers and start being neighbors. By marrying into the CROATOAN or Roanoke tribes, they survived the only way they could, by shedding their European armor and their London clothes and learning how to live with the land, and not just off of it. The ghost of Roanoke is not a ghost of death, but a ghost of transformation. So why does Roanoke remain the most famous mystery in American history? It is because it provides a blank slate for our national identity. It is a story that contains everything: adventure, betrayal, a mysterious carving, a newborn baby, and a vanishing act. It is the American King Arthur, a legend rooted in fact but elevated by the unknown. Every generation reinterprets Roanoke. In the 19th century, it was a romantic tragedy. In the mid-20th century, it was a story of survival against all odds. Today, it is a forensic puzzle that we are solving with satellites and DNA. We keep looking for them because, in a way, they are our founding families who didn't get to write the history books. They represent the grit and the absolute vulnerability of the first contact between the old world and the new. As we close this story, I want to go back to that August day in 1590 with John White. Imagine him touching the letters CROATOAN carved into the post. For 400 years, we have treated that word as a riddle or a curse. But if you look at the evidence we've discussed today, the drought, the Site X findings, the diplomatic ties with Matteo, that word wasn't a riddle, it was a map. It was a message of hope. It was 115 people telling the man who left them, "We have moved on, we are still alive, come find us." The tragedy isn't that they disappeared. The tragedy is that the world they came from was too violent, too greedy, and too distracted by war to go and find them when it mattered the most. Roanoke reminds us that history is often made in the silences. It reminds us that for every great man like Raleigh, there are 100 people like Eleanor Dare and George Howe, whose names were nearly forgotten, but whose lives were the real cost of empire. We may never find a definitive grave for Virginia Dare. We may never know exactly which village her parents eventually called home. But as long as we keep searching the woods of North Carolina and the archives of London, the 1587 colony is never truly lost. They are found every time we ask the questions that bridge the gap between their worlds and ours. I hope you enjoyed the story of the lost colony of Roanoke, and I'll see you next time.